Eleanor Whitmore stood on platform 9 of London's Victoria Station, clutching a photograph so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The black and white image showed a young man in military uniform, his smile bright with the innocence of someone who had never seen war. It was October 15, 1943, and she had been waiting for 3 hours. The 2:30 train from Dover had arrived and departed. So had the 4:15. But her son Michael wasn't on either of them. "He promised he'd be on the evening train, Mother," she whispered to herself, the same words she'd been repeating like a prayer. He promised. The station master, a kind man named George Pemberton who had worked these platforms for 23 years, approached her cautiously. He had seen too many mothers like Eleanor during these war years, women whose hope burned so fiercely it could light up the darkest corners of the station, yet whose eyes held a terror so deep it made grown men weep. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, his voice barely audible above the steam and chatter. "Perhaps you should go home, get some rest. If there's any word—" But Eleanor shook her head, never taking her eyes off the tracks. "No, George. He said he'd be home for my birthday. Today is my birthday. And Michael has never broken a promise to me. Not once in his 22 years. What Eleanor didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that at that very moment, 847 miles away in the Italian mountains near Monte Cassino, her son lay dying in a crater created by German artillery. His last thoughts weren't of the battle raging around him, or of the friends he'd lost, or even of the letter in his breast pocket that would never be delivered. His last thoughts were of his mother, standing on that platform, waiting for a train that would never bring him home. The photograph in Eleanor's hands had been taken just 6 months earlier, during Michael's last leave. They had spent 3 perfect days together, walking through Hyde Park, sharing afternoon tea at their favorite cafe on Baker Street, and attending Sunday service at St. Mary's, where she had prayed for his safe return every day since he'd enlisted. On his last morning home, as they stood together on this very platform, Michael had taken her hands in his. "Mother," he had said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty ahead, "I promise you this. I will come home for your birthday. No matter what happens over there, no matter how long this war drags on, I will be on that evening train on October 15th. We'll celebrate together, just like we always have." Eleanor had smiled through her tears that morning, watching his train disappear into the distance, carrying her only child toward a war that had already claimed too many sons. She had clung to his promise through the sleepless nights, through the rationing and the air raids, through the telegrams that arrived daily in their neighborhood, each one breaking another mother's heart. Now, as the evening shadows grew longer across the platform, Eleanor's faith remained unshakable. She adjusted her small hat, the blue one Michael had bought her for Christmas, and smoothed her coat. She wanted to look her best when he arrived. She had even managed to save enough sugar rations to bake his favorite lemon cake, despite the shortages. It waited at home, carefully wrapped, along with the small gift she had been saving since before the war began. The 6:45 train approached with its familiar rumble and hiss. Eleanor's heart quickened as it slowed to a stop. Passengers began disembarking, businessmen returning from their day trips, a few soldiers on leave, women clutching their handbags and looking anxiously for familiar faces. She scanned each face, her breath catching every time she glimpsed a military uniform, but Michael wasn't among them. As the train pulled away, Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly, but only for a moment. There would be another train. There was always another train, and Michael had promised. In a world where nothing seemed certain anymore, where families were torn apart and young men disappeared into the darkness of war, Eleanor held on to that promise like a lifeline. The station began to empty as evening fell. Shopkeepers closed their small stands, and most of the waiting passengers had found their loved ones or accepted that they wouldn't be coming that night. But Eleanor remained, a solitary figure under the flickering station lights, still clutching that photograph, still believing with every fiber of her being that her son would keep his word. What she didn't know was that this would be only the beginning of her wait, a wait that would test the very limits of a mother's love and faith. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor's birthday, and she had returned to Victoria Station every evening. The other regular commuters had begun to recognize her. The woman in the blue hat who stood on platform 9, always in the same spot, always watching the trains with desperate hope. Some whispered about her behind gloved hands. Others nodded respectfully, understanding that grief and hope often walked hand in hand during wartime. George Pemberton had tried several times to convince Eleanor to contact the War Office, to make inquiries about her son's regiment. But she refused, insisting that Michael would have written if there had been any delays. The truth was, Eleanor hadn't received a letter from Michael in over 2 months. but she had convinced herself that the postal system was simply overwhelmed. Surely there was a bag of mail somewhere, filled with his letters, just waiting to be delivered. At home in her small flat on Cromwell Road, Eleanor had created a ritual that kept her sanity intact. Each morning, she would read Michael's last letter, dated August 14th, 1943. In it, he had written about the Italian countryside, about the kindness of some local villagers who had shared their meager food supplies with his unit. He had described the sunset over the Mediterranean, how it reminded him of the evenings they used to spend on Brighton Beach before the war. "The beauty of this place makes it hard to believe there's a war going on," he had written. "Sometimes I sit and watch the sunrise, and I think about our Sunday morning breakfasts. How you always made my eggs exactly the way I liked them, and how you would read me the funny bits from the newspaper. I miss those mornings, Mother. I miss them more than I can say." Every evening after her vigil at the station, Eleanor would sit at her small kitchen table and write letters to Michael. She told him about the neighbors, about the small victories and defeats of life on the home front. She wrote about Mrs. Henderson from next door, who had received word that her eldest son was safe in North Africa. She wrote about the new rationing restrictions and how she had managed to trade her cigarette rations for extra tea, knowing how much he loved a proper cup when he was home. "My dearest Michael," she wrote on November 3rd, "I waited for you again today, but I understand that military transport can be unpredictable. Perhaps tomorrow's train will bring you home. I've been saving stories to tell you, funny things that have happened, little moments that I know will make you smile. Mrs. Patterson's cat got stuck in the Anderson shelter again, and it took 3 of us to coax him out. You would have laughed at the sight of us, crawling around on our hands and knees, making kissing sounds at a terrified Tabby." But even as she wrote these letters, a small voice in the back of Eleanor's mind had begun to whisper doubts. Other mothers in the neighborhood had received telegrams, some bearing good news, others bearing the worst news imaginable. Why hadn't she heard anything at all? Dorothy Hawthorne, who lived 2 streets over, had received a telegram in September informing her that her son James had been wounded, but was recovering in a military hospital in Sicily. 2 weeks later, she received a letter from James himself, confirming that he was alive and would be home for Christmas. Eleanor found herself envying Dorothy's certainty, even if it came with worry about her son's injuries. Then there was Margaret Cole, who had received the telegram every mother dreaded, the one that began with "We regret to inform you." Eleanor had attended Margaret's son's memorial service at St. Mary's, watching as a mother laid flowers at an altar for a boy whose body would never come home. The sight had shaken Eleanor to her core. Not because she feared the same fate, but because she realized how lucky Margaret was to know her son's fate, however tragic. At least Margaret could grieve. At least she could begin to heal. Eleanor existed in a purgatory of uncertainty, suspended between hope and despair, between faith and the growing whispers of doubt that she fought so hard to silence. On November 10th, as she stood on Platform 9 waiting for the evening train from Dover, Eleanor noticed a young soldier watching her. He couldn't have been more than 19, with sandy hair and kind eyes that reminded her of Michael at that age. He approached her hesitantly, removing his cap as he drew near. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a soft Yorkshire accent. "I don't mean to intrude, but I've noticed you here several evenings. Are you waiting for someone?" Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed in weeks. "My son, Michael. He's coming home on leave. He promised he'd be on one of these evening trains." The young soldier's expression grew troubled. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what regiment is your son with?" "The 2nd Battalion, Coldstream Guards," Eleanor replied proudly. "He's serving in Italy." The color drained from the young soldier's face. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, clearly struggling with some internal battle. Finally, he said quietly, "Ma'am, I think perhaps you should speak with someone at the War Office. Sometimes letters get delayed. Sometimes information doesn't reach families as quickly as it should." But Eleanor shook her head firmly. "No, dear. Michael promised he would come home for my birthday. He's never broken a promise to me. There must simply be transportation delays. These things happen during wartime." The young soldier looked as though he wanted to say more, but the train arrived with its familiar rumble, and Eleanor's attention immediately turned to the passengers disembarking. She scanned each face with renewed hope, her heart racing as she searched for the one face that would make everything right again. But once again, Michael wasn't among them. As the young soldier boarded the train to continue his own journey home, he turned back to look at Eleanor one last time. She was still standing there, still watching, still waiting. He had wanted to tell her what he had heard through military channels about the 2nd Battalion, Coldstream Guards, but he couldn't bring himself to be the one to destroy her hope. Some truths, he thought, were too heavy for strangers to carry. That night, Eleanor returned to her flat and wrote another letter to Michael. But for the first time, her words carried a note of pleading rather than simple love and news. "Please write to me soon, my darling boy," she wrote. "I know you must be busy, but a mother worries when she doesn't hear from her son. Even a few lines would ease my heart. I'll keep waiting for you, just as I promised. Every evening, I'll be there, watching for your train." December arrived with an unusual brutality, bringing the worst winter London had seen in years. The platforms of Victoria Station were slick with ice, and the waiting areas provided little shelter from the bitter wind that seemed to cut through even the heaviest coats. But Eleanor continued her daily vigil, now armed with extra scarves and a thermos of hot tea that George Pemberton had insisted she bring. The station master had become her unofficial guardian, checking on her each evening, sometimes bringing her a warm meat pie from his wife's kitchen, other times simply standing with her in companionable silence. He had stopped suggesting that she go home or contact the authorities. He had learned that Eleanor's hope was not something that could be reasoned with or explained away. 47 days, Eleanor murmured to herself as she stood on Platform 9 on December 1st. She had been counting since her birthday, marking each day in her small diary with a neat tick mark, as if documenting her faithfulness would somehow speed Michael's return. The routine had become as fixed as the sunrise. Eleanor would rise at 6 a.m., prepare breakfast for two out of habit, then catch the morning bus to the market for whatever provisions were available with her ration coupons. She would spend the afternoon cleaning her already spotless flat, preparing for Michael's homecoming. At 4 p.m. precisely, she would make her way to Victoria Station, positioning herself at the exact spot where she had waited on her birthday. But the toll was beginning to show. Eleanor had lost nearly a stone in weight, and her clothes hung loose on her diminishing frame. The blue hat that Michael had bought her now sat too large on her head, and she had to pin it in place. Her neighbors had begun to worry, taking turns to check on her, bringing small offerings of food or company. "Eleanor, dear," said Mrs. Henderson one afternoon as she knocked on the door with a pot of soup. "You look terribly thin. Are you eating properly?" Eleanor smiled, the same polite smile she had perfected over the past weeks. "Oh yes, I'm fine. Just saving up my appetite for when Michael comes home. He does so love a proper feast when he's on leave." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with concern, but she didn't press the matter. Like everyone else in the neighborhood, she had heard the whispers about Eleanor's daily vigil at the station. Some said it was admirable, a mother's love in its purest form. Others whispered that grief had driven her to the edge of madness. The truth was more complex than either explanation could capture. Eleanor wasn't mad, but she had become a prisoner of her own hope. Each day that passed without word from Michael should have weakened her belief. But instead, it seemed to strengthen her resolve. In her mind, the longer she waited, the more miraculous his return would be, and the more her faithfulness would be rewarded. She had developed elaborate explanations for every possible scenario. If Michael had been wounded, he would have been transported to a hospital, causing delays in his leave. If his unit had been reassigned, the paperwork would have been slow to reach London. If he had been promoted, there would have been additional responsibilities keeping him from writing. Every silence had a reasonable explanation, every delay a logical cause. On December 15th, Eleanor's vigil was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. A middle-aged woman in a dark coat approached her on the platform, her expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you Eleanor Whitmore?" Eleanor turned, surprised to be addressed by name by a stranger. "Yes, I am. Do I know you?" "My name is Patricia Summers. My son David served with your Michael in the 2nd Battalion." Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think we need to talk." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Oh, how wonderful. Is David home? Did he bring news of Michael? Is that why Michael's been delayed?" Patricia's face crumpled slightly, and she reached out to take Eleanor's arm. "Mrs. Whitmore, David came home last week. He's recovering from his wounds at the military hospital in Chelsea. He told me about you, about how you've been waiting here every day. He asked me to come speak with you." "Wonderful," Eleanor exclaimed, her eyes bright with hope. "When will David be well enough to visit? I have so many questions about Michael's unit, about what they've been doing in Italy. I'm sure he has letters from Michael, or messages." "Mrs. Whitmore, please." Patricia's voice was kind but insistent. "David told me. He told me about Monte Cassino." The name meant nothing to Eleanor, but something in Patricia's tone made her stomach clench, with a fear she had been fighting for months. What about it? Is that where Michael's unit is stationed? Patricia looked around the busy platform, then gently guided Eleanor to a quieter corner near the station wall. David was there at the battle. He was wounded during the final assault in October. Mrs. Whitmore, the casualties were... There were so many casualties. Eleanor shook her head firmly. No, you don't understand. Michael promised he would come home for my birthday. He's never broken a promise to me. If something had happened, someone would have told me. I would have received a telegram. Sometimes, Patricia said carefully. In the confusion of battle, in the chaos of war, things get lost. Records get mixed up. Communications break down. She paused, struggling with her next words. David remembers your son. He said Michael was a good soldier, a good friend to the other men. Was? Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. Patricia nodded slowly. Mrs. Whitmore, David saw Michael fall during the attack on the monastery. He saw him trying to help wounded comrades get to safety. He said Michael died as he lived, thinking of others before himself. For a moment, Eleanor stood perfectly still, as if the words hadn't penetrated her consciousness. Then she began to shake her head, slowly at first, then more vigorously. No, she said. No, that's not possible. David must be confused. The wounds, the trauma. Sometimes soldiers remember things that didn't happen. Michael promised me. He promised. Patricia's eyes filled with tears as she watched Eleanor retreat back into her protective shell of denial. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. I know how hard this must be. Hard? Eleanor's voice took on a sharp edge. It's not hard at all because it's not true. Michael is coming home. He's probably on his way right now. You'll see. He'll be on tonight's train, or tomorrow's, and then you'll understand that your son was mistaken. Patricia tried once more. Please, won't you at least contact the War Office? They can provide official confirmation. But Eleanor had already turned away, walking back to her usual spot on the platform. The 6:45 from Dover will be here soon, she called over her shoulder. Michael might be on it. He promised he would come home. Patricia watched helplessly as Eleanor resumed her vigil, standing straight and proud, despite the devastating news she had just received. As Patricia walked away, she wondered if she had done the right thing in coming. Some truths, she realized, were too terrible to be accepted all at once. Perhaps Eleanor's mind was protecting her in the only way it could. But deep inside, beneath all her conscious denial, Eleanor's heart had heard Patricia's words and recognized their truth. The knowledge settled there like a stone, heavy and cold, waiting for the moment when her conscious mind would be strong enough to acknowledge what she already knew. That night, for the first time since October 15th, Eleanor's letter to Michael carried a different tone. My dearest son, she wrote, her hand trembling slightly. If you are hurt, if you need help, please know that I will never stop looking for you. If you are lost, I will never stop waiting. A mother's love doesn't end with death, and a mother's hope doesn't die with her child. I will be here on Platform 9 for as long as it takes. This is my promise to you. Christmas of 1943 came and went without celebration in Eleanor's small flat. She had set the table for two, as she had every day since October, but the untouched place setting across from her seemed to mock her faithful routine. The lemon cake she had baked for Michael's birthday had long since been thrown away, but she had baked another for Christmas, and then another for New Year's, each one representing her unwavering belief that he would come home in time for the next celebration. By January, even George Pemberton was beginning to worry about Eleanor's mental state. The winter had been particularly harsh, and several times he had found her nearly unconscious from cold, still standing at her post on Platform 9. He had convinced her to wait inside the station building during the worst weather, but she insisted on positioning herself where she could see every arriving train. Mrs. Whitmore, he said one evening in late January, as she swayed slightly from exhaustion and cold. I've spoken with my wife. She thinks you should come home with me tonight, have a proper meal, sleep in a warm bed. Eleanor looked at him with eyes that had grown hollow over the past months. That's very kind, George, but I couldn't possibly. What if Michael arrives tonight? What if he comes looking for me and I'm not here? He would think I had given up on him. George had stopped trying to reason with her. He had seen this before, during the Great War, when he was just a young porter. He had watched mothers and wives and sweethearts wait at stations long after any rational hope had died. Some eventually accepted reality and began the painful process of grief. Others, like Eleanor, became ghosts of themselves, haunting the places where their loved ones should have appeared. It was on February 14th, 1944, exactly 4 months after Eleanor's birthday, that the final piece of evidence arrived. She was at the station, as always, when a young woman in a Red Cross uniform approached her. The woman carried a canvas bag filled with personal effects, items that had been recovered from battlefields and hospitals across Europe. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore?" the woman asked gently. Eleanor turned, and for a moment, hope flared in her eyes. Perhaps this woman had news. Perhaps she carried letters that had been delayed in the military postal system. "Yes, I'm Eleanor Whitmore. My name is Susan Fletcher. I work with the Red Cross, helping to return personal items to families." Susan reached into her bag and withdrew a small, wrapped bundle. These belonged to Private Michael Whitmore, 2nd Battalion Coldstream Guards. Eleanor stared at the bundle as if it were a poisonous snake. "I don't understand. Why would you have Michael's things? He's coming home. He's simply been delayed." Susan's voice was infinitely gentle as she continued. "Mrs. Whitmore, these items were found with your son's body after the Battle of Monte Cassino. I'm so very sorry for your loss." Eleanor shook her head violently. No, that's impossible." "You're mistaken. Michael promised he would come home for my birthday. He would never break a promise to his mother." But even as she spoke the words, her eyes were drawn to the bundle in Susan's hands. She could see the corner of a familiar envelope, recognized the handwriting as her own. These were the letters she had sent to Michael, the ones that had never been answered because there had been no one left to read them. Susan held out the bundle. "Would you like to take these, Mrs. Whitmore? There are some letters he was carrying, some photographs, and a few personal items." With trembling hands, Eleanor accepted the bundle. It was surprisingly light, the sum total of a young man's life reduced to a few precious objects that had survived the violence of war. She unwrapped it slowly, her breath catching as familiar items were revealed. There was the watch she had given Michael for his 18th birthday. Its crystal cracked, but the face still readable. There were photographs of the two of them together, taken during happier times before the war had torn their world apart. There were the unanswered letters she had written, the ones marked "Return to Sender," that had never been processed due to the chaos of battle. And at the bottom of the bundle was an envelope she didn't recognize, one that bore her name in Michael's familiar handwriting. It was dated October 10th, 1943, 5 days before her birthday, 5 days before the battle that had taken her son's life. With shaking fingers, Eleanor opened the envelope and began to read. "My dearest mother, if you are reading this letter, then something has happened to me, and I will not be able to keep my promise to come home for your birthday. I am writing this because we have received orders to advance on a heavily fortified position, and I want you to know, in case I don't survive, how much your love has meant to me throughout my life. I want you to know that every morning, when I wake up in this terrible place, the first thing I think about is you. I remember your smile when I was a child, and had disappointed you with some mischief, how you could never stay angry with me for long. I remember how you used to read to me on Sunday afternoons, and how safe I felt in our small flat, just the two of us against the world. I know I promised to come home for your birthday, and I meant that promise with all my heart. But if I cannot keep it, I need you to promise me something in return. Promise me that you will not wait for me forever. Promise me that you will find a way to be happy again, to live again, even if I am not there to share it with you. You gave me everything a mother could give a son: love, strength, values, hope. You taught me to be brave when I was frightened, to be kind when others were cruel, to keep my promises whenever possible. If I die here, I will die knowing that I was loved completely, and that is a gift not every man receives. Please don't let my death be the end of your life, Mother. You have so much love left to give, so much good left to do in this world. If I cannot come home to you, then you must live for both of us. I love you more than words can express. Your devoted son, Michael." Eleanor read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated her consciousness. When they did, something inside her broke. Not her hope, which had been slowly dying for months, but the wall she had built to protect herself from the truth she had already known in her heart. She sank to her knees on platform 9, still clutching the letter, and for the first time in 4 months, she began to cry. The tears came in great, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear themselves from the depths of her soul. Other passengers stopped to stare, some offered help, but Eleanor was beyond their reach, lost in a grief so profound it seemed to alter the very air around her. George Pemberton knelt beside her, his own eyes wet with tears. He had seen her hope finally break, and he understood that this moment, terrible as it was, marked the beginning of her healing. The waiting was over. The vigil had ended. Now the real work of grief could begin. "He's not coming home, is he?" Eleanor whispered through her tears. "No, love," George said gently. "He's not coming home." For the first time in 122 days, Eleanor Whitmore left Victoria Station without looking back at the tracks. The train she had been waiting for would never arrive. because the passenger she loved most in the world was already home, not in London, but in whatever place souls go when their earthly journey ends. 1 year later, on October 15th, 1944, Eleanor returned to Victoria Station. But this time, she wasn't waiting for a train. She was there to say goodbye to a different kind of journey entirely. The platform looked exactly as it had during those long months of waiting, but Eleanor herself had changed in ways that went far deeper than the gray that had crept into her hair, or the lines that grief had etched around her eyes. She carried herself differently now, with the quiet dignity of someone who had walked through the fire of loss and emerged, if not whole, then at least willing to keep living. In her handbag, she carried Michael's final letter, along with a letter of her own, one she had written to him on every anniversary of his death, a tradition that had become her way of maintaining their connection across the impossible distance between life and death. Today's letter was different from the others. Today, she had finally found the words to say goodbye. "My dearest Michael," she whispered, reading from the pages she had written that morning. "Today marks 1 year since you were supposed to come home for my birthday. I have spent these 12 months learning how to live in a world without you, and it has been the hardest education of my life. I want you to know that I kept my vigil for as long as I could, not because I couldn't accept that you were gone, but because loving you was the only thing that made sense in a senseless world. Waiting for you was my way of honoring the promises we made to each other, even when those promises became impossible to keep. I have learned that grief is not something we get over, but something we learn to carry. I have learned that love doesn't end with death, but it must transform if we are to go on living. I have learned that keeping faith with the dead means more than preserving their memory. It means living the kind of life that would make them proud. Today, I am finally ready to stop waiting for trains that will never come. But I am not ready to stop loving you, and I never will be. Instead, I am going to love you in a different way, by living the kind of life you would have wanted for me, by finding ways to help other mothers who are walking the path I have walked, by ensuring that your sacrifice was not in vain. I am going to volunteer at the hospital, helping wounded soldiers write letters to their families. I am going to work with the Red Cross, helping to reunite families with their lost loved ones. I am going to live, Michael, because that is what you asked me to do in your final letter. But I want you to know that every evening, when I see the sun setting through my kitchen window, I will think of you and smile. Every morning when I make my breakfast, I will remember the boy who loved my scrambled eggs and couldn't start his day without a proper cup of tea. Every time I see a young soldier at the station, I will say a prayer for him and for the mother who is waiting for his return. This is my promise to you. My darling son, I will stop waiting for you to come home, but I will never stop carrying you with me wherever I go. You are part of me forever, and that is a gift that not even war can take away. Your loving mother, Eleanor. As she finished reading, Eleanor noticed a young woman standing nearby, watching the trains with the same desperate hope that Eleanor remembered from her own vigil. The woman was probably no more than 25, well-dressed, but with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been waiting too long for news that wasn't coming. Eleanor approached her gently. "Excuse me, dear. Are you waiting for someone?" The young woman turned, and Eleanor saw herself as she had been 1 year ago, caught between hope and despair, clinging to faith because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. "My husband," the woman said. "He was supposed to be home from France 2 weeks ago. His unit was involved in some kind of operation, but I haven't heard anything. I keep thinking he must be on the next train, or the one after that." Eleanor's heart ached with recognition. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small card, the address of a support group for military families that she had helped to establish 6 months earlier. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "I've been where you are, dear. I know how it feels to wait and hope and pray for news that seems like it will never come. Would you like to talk? Would you like someone to wait with you?" The young woman's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Would you? I feel like I'm going mad, standing here day after day, but I can't bear to leave, in case he comes looking for you," Eleanor finished. "I understand completely. What's your name?" "Margaret. Margaret Phillips." "Well, Margaret, why don't we wait together? And while we wait, I'll tell you about some resources that might help us find news of your husband's unit. Sometimes the official channels are slow, but there are other ways to get information." As the two women stood together on Platform 9, watching for trains that might or might not carry the people they loved most, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year, a sense of purpose beyond her own grief, a reason to keep going that extended beyond the boundaries of her own loss. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that love doesn't end with death, but it must find new ways to express itself if we are to survive the losses that define our lives. Her vigil at the station had ended, but her vigil for other grieving families was just beginning. 6 months later, Eleanor received a letter that would change everything. It came from the War Office, but it wasn't the telegram she had once feared. Instead, it was a formal notification that Michael had been posthumously awarded the Military Cross for his actions during the Battle of Monte Cassino. The citation read, "For conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty while attempting to rescue wounded comrades under heavy enemy fire." But more importantly, the letter included an invitation to attend a ceremony at Buckingham Palace, where she would receive Michael's medal on his behalf. The ceremony was scheduled for October 15, 1945, exactly 2 years after the birthday when she had first begun her vigil at Victoria Station. On that day, Eleanor stood in the grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace, wearing the blue hat that Michael had given her for Christmas, holding the medal that represented the best of what her son had been. When the king pinned the ribbon to her lapel and expressed his condolences for her loss, Eleanor felt something she had thought was lost forever: pride in her son's life rather than only sorrow for his death. After the ceremony, Eleanor returned to Victoria Station one final time, not to wait for a train, but to keep a different kind of promise. She walked to Platform 9 and stood in the exact spot where she had spent so many hours of her life, where she had learned the difference between hope and faith, between love and obsession, between holding on and letting go. "I did it. Michael," she whispered to the empty air. "I learned how to live again. I learned how to love again. I learned how to help other mothers find their way through the darkness you and I walked together. Your sacrifice meant something, my darling boy. Your life meant something, and now mine does too." As Eleanor walked away from Platform 9 for the last time, she passed a memorial that had been erected for all the sons and daughters who would never come home from the war. She paused to read the inscription. "Their sacrifice shall not be forgotten, and their love shall not be lost," Eleanor smiled, understanding at last that some trains are meant to carry us toward reunions, while others carry us toward acceptance. Some journeys end in joy, others in sorrow, but all of them have the power to transform us if we have the courage to complete them. The train Michael was supposed to take had never arrived at Victoria Station, but in learning to stop waiting for it, Eleanor had discovered something infinitely more valuable: that love finds a way to survive even the most devastating losses, and that sometimes the most important journey is the one that teaches us how to say goodbye. Years later, when people asked Eleanor about her time waiting at the station, she would tell them that she hadn't been waiting for a train at all. She had been waiting for the strength to accept that some promises can only be kept in our hearts, and that the deepest love sometimes means learning when to let go. Eleanor Whitmore lived to be 87 years old. She never remarried, but she was never alone. Her small flat on Cromwell Road became a gathering place for military families, a sanctuary for mothers and wives and sweethearts who needed someone who understood their particular kind of grief. She helped establish 3 support centers across London and personally assisted over 200 families in their search for missing loved ones. On her bedside table, until the day she died, she kept 2 photographs: one of Michael in his uniform, smiling with the confidence of youth, and another of herself standing on Platform 9, taken by a newspaper reporter who had been documenting the human stories of wartime London. In that second photograph, Eleanor's face shows all the devastation and hope and love that defined those months of waiting. It became one of the most famous images of the war's impact on the home front, a testament to the power of a mother's love and the price of holding on too long to promises that can never be kept. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Eleanor's story is what happened after she stopped waiting. In helping other families navigate their own darkness, she discovered that grief shared is grief divided, and love shared is love multiplied. She found that in teaching others how to say goodbye, she had finally learned how to say hello to the rest of her life. The last entry in Eleanor's diary, written the night before she died, read simply, "Tomorrow I will see my son again. This time, I won't have to wait for the train. In every mother's love, there exists a promise that transcends time, space, and even death itself." Eleanor's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to stop holding on and start letting go. Her vigil ended, but her love never did. It simply found new ways to heal the world. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think of someone you've loved and lost, or if it reminded you of the power of hope and the necessity of healing, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when we're brave enough to share our own stories of love and loss. And if Eleanor's journey resonated with you, Consider subscribing for more stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love.